Good morning. I'm super excited to start this sourdough adventure with you. And I know lots of people are making sourdough these days, and people are in their sourdough era, apparently, at Costco. And there's a whole world of information out there. And I think it gets a little bit complicated and a little bit confusing and maybe a little bit overwhelming. Some people just are like, forget it, I'm not gonna make sourdough. But I wanna show you some things to show you that it's actually very, very doable. You really could be making like the bread for your family and not having to buy bread, and then getting all the beautiful benefits of the byproducts of fermentation that are good for your gut. And it seems like everything goes back to the gut these days, right? Like that is like the buzzword for everything. Mental health, everything is related to what you eat and what you're putting in, and what you're picking up in your gut is affecting your brain. So there's lots to be said about fermented foods for helping that and helping the gut to get healthy, especially as it relates to bread and wheat and gluten. Sourdough is really one of your best choices if you're gonna eat bread. So I want to make this easier for you and easier to do so that it's actually something that you feel like you can do. Even and I've been baking bread for a while, when I get on the internet and start looking at stuff about sourdough, I'm like, I don't know, I have to redo everything. I don't, like my bread comes out fine. Like I'm sure there's even more things that I could do. I've added things that I didn't used to do, and I think it has made my bread better. So there's always room for improvement, but you can start basic and make really good bread. So I'm gonna give you some basics in this course, and try not to be all over the place, which sometimes when I get excited about something, I start jumping all over and talking about things long before I need to. So I'll try to be organized in my thoughts and organized in my talking and try not to overwhelm you with information. But what I will tell you is I do talk fast. I try to talk slow. It's almost impossible. I will have a Google Doc that I will put down all the numbers that I'm saying so that you can see just step by step what you need to do each day, the night before, the day of, and what to add and those sorts of things. And then like if there's, I let this sit for 20 minutes or I added 500 grams of flour. So you have those numbers, so you don't have to be trying to write them down while I'm talking. I will give you that information at the end of the course, so don't worry about that. So what is the first thing we need to talk about with sourdough? The first thing we need to talk about is starter. If you don't have any starter, it is hard to make sourdough. Some people make their own starter. That is okay and hard. It can be a frustrating task. Sometimes as you're trying to collect wild yeasts in the air, you also collect bacteria that's in the air and a whole host of other things. And so often when people are trying to make their own starter, they end up growing other things in there, and you just have to keep starting over and you have to let it go a while before it's strong enough to bake bread. So certainly try that if you feel like you want to try that challenge. But I would suggest, if what you're really excited about is baking bread, that you just get some sourdough starter from a friend. Anyone that's making sourdough has sourdough starter to share. Often people are selling their starter, discard. When you hear that word discard, that doesn't mean it's bad or something you should throw away. It's just when you feed your starter, you take some away. So you just start with a little bit, and that part that you would take away is really good, happy starter. You will hear that word to reference that. So discard sounds like something you would throw away, and you might if you don't need it, but it's something you could share as well. So a lot of people sell their discard, but I bet you have a friend that's making sourdough that would be happy to just share their discard with you. And if you live near me in Indy, I would be happy to give you some of my starter, so just let me know. So somewhere you get some starter and someone's gonna give you a jar of something. My jar, you'll see, like, it's not liquid. Shake it around, that's not gonna move around. You may get some starter, most likely, from someone that's more liquid, and it could slosh around. It's more like pancake batter, but it would move around in the jar. That's called a liquid starter. They both can bake bread. I have found that I prefer a stiff starter. I've just learned this recently and changed over to it, and I will not go back. I love my stiff starter. I think that it stays healthier and happier on the counter in my kitchen than my liquid starter. I've learned that yeast prefer a drier environment. So when you have that really liquidy wet starter, they still grow, they just don't prefer that environment. They seem to prefer it more dry. And I've seen that to be true. My yeast seems very happy in this dry starter. So that's how I do mine. So that's what I'm gonna teach you. But certainly if you have a liquid starter, when I make that document, I can also tell you how to feed a liquid starter if you'd prefer to keep it liquid. Yeah, it's a matter of preference a little bit, but I think once you try the stiff starter, you might, if you've been using a liquid starter, you might find that you really like the stiff starter. It's just super easy to work with. So you have your starter, and then people get this starter from someone and they're like, what do I do with the starter? I don't want to kill it. And often it just dies on your counter. So the one thing I would do is, if you're going to leave it on the counter, is take a little bit out, put it in a little jar, and keep it in the refrigerator as your backup, so that if you mess up your starter, you've got something else to work with. So number one, I do that anyway. In fact, my husband just cleared out the fridge and threw away my backup, so I really need to save some more backup, because life happens and you have it on the counter and you intend to bake bread or you intend to feed it and you forget, right? Like, I've done that many, many times. I'd like to say I've had this starter. I always want to say I've had this starter for 50 years and pass it on to my children, and it's named and it's never died, but I've killed my starter many, many times. We also are friends with someone who is a professional pastry chef and always has sourdough starter, so he is my backup as well. Thanks, Paul, if you happen to ever see this. So have a backup in the refrigerator, and then yes, you need to feed your starter. And I feed mine about every 2 to 3 days, because that's how frequently I bake, and my starter does okay. I have read that if you feed it every day, it's a happier starter, it's gonna make better bread. And so I wouldn't argue with that. It's probably true. I've just found that feeding mine every 2 to 3 days, especially in the winter, when the yeast are a little bit, it's just colder in my kitchen, so they're not eating the flour quite as quickly. I'm usually okay with 2 to 3 days. So you can decide that for yourself. If you have a newer starter, I probably would feed it more frequently, and that will help it to be a happier starter. This was starter that I got from the friend that I referenced, and I'm guessing it was a pretty solid starter. Not solid like stiff starter, but pretty robust starter. Those yeast were really happy, so it works really, really well for me. When I feed my starter with a stiff starter, I get my scale out, and I take about 100 grams of my starter, and then I feed about 200 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. So I have twice as much flour as I do water, so that when I mix that all up, it's gonna be like a ball of dough. I'm gonna show this to you, but I thought I'd talk you through it. Sometimes I'm not as good at talking and showing, so I wanted to explain it all to you. I mix it all up, and I have this kind of shaggy dough, and then I just get my hand in there and I mix it around to try to really distribute that stiff starter that was there with the water and flour that I've added. Some people call this a levain. I don't even know if that's how you say the word. I am not French, and I do not speak French. It's not a language I've learned very much of, besides, oui and mon chéri. I've got a few phrases, but I get in there and mix that around, and I kind of knead it like I'm kneading a ball of dough, and then that's gonna be my, that's not just starter at that point. I'm getting ready. Well, let me back up. That could just be my starter that I've fed, and then, okay, it's fed and I'm not gonna do anything with it. I'm just gonna wait a few days and feed it again because I'm not ready to bake bread. Or that can be called a levain, something that you're getting ready to bake with the next day. And that'll be our next step. So we'll pause there. That's just feeding your starter. You feed it, if you're keeping a stiff starter, twice as much flour as water, and then usually about 100 grams of your starter that you have. And then we'll get to the next step. So we'll stop there.